Hi guys, now welcome to our reading of Act 1, Scene 1. So I've got everything set up here. Okay, I have my free Shakespeare app and I've accessed then Act 1, Scene 1 of Othello. And basically before we begin, you should have your 6 basic points jotted down. Okay, so what you're going to be looking out for, what you're going to observe and notice then as you're actually reading through. Okay, so number 1 then you would jot down setting. Okay, so what do we learn about the setting then at the very beginning of the play? Number 2 then plot, and we can fill that in then as we're actually reading through Act 1, Scene 1. So we should have maybe we say 3, 4, 5 different points relating to plot. Number 3 then would be character or characters and their relationships. Okay, so who appears in Act 1, Scene 1? Do they have a very particular role as such to play, like a designated role? What's their function or purpose in the play? And do we notice any particular traits or characteristics or attributes? Do we notice contrasting characters or foils? Do we notice similar characters? What kind of relationships, what kind of interactions do we notice at the beginning of the play? We also then have themes, okay? So think about, we say, the obvious themes that should come to mind when we focus on Othello. So racism would be one, or discrimination, or just race itself. It's an exploration, perhaps we'd say, of race and racism. Exploitation or manipulation would be a particular theme or idea in the play. Betrayal would be another one as well. Okay, so we should be watching out for different examples, we'd say, in terms of the characters and their behaviour. Okay, so that's theme. We should also look out then for particular images or symbols which crop up in the play. And remember, of course, this can also involve motifs, repeated symbols or images that reoccur throughout the play. So, for example, we look at something like, we'd say, contrasting images of light and darkness. That's a very obvious one. Okay, we can look out for, we say, something like classical allusions, so references to Greek and Roman mythology. We can look out for, we'd say, animal imagery or natural images in terms of what they represent and how they relate back, we'd say, to plot or setting, perhaps. More likely, they would relate back to characters and themes. And finally, then we can consider stagecraft. Okay, so what would the lighting and music and costumes look like? Where would the characters or the actors really position themselves on stage? So how would you direct or produce Othello, or specifically this particular scene, whatever aspect or whatever extract happens to come up then on your summer assessment paper? Okay, so at the very beginning, Shakespeare doesn't go into an awful lot of detail here when it comes to stage directions. It simply says Venice, a street. Okay, so we know that it's an external scene and it's focusing then on the city of Venice itself. Now, as we're reading through, we begin to realise, of course, that it's a night scene. So it's not just an external scene, it's a night scene. We kind of think, okay, what's the symbolism of nighttime here? Is this about something that happens, we say, under cover of darkness? Is it about, we'd say, unspoken secrets? Is it about devious behaviour? Is it about criminal behaviour? Okay, so we have to kind of think about what the night actually symbolises and how dark the stage would be, and whether you would have spotlights trained on the two main characters who appear at the very beginning of the play. Okay, you could say, maybe we'd say that nighttime could be associated with the villain of the piece, Iago, who appears in this particular scene. Because think about it, we've had exactly the same when it comes to something like Macbeth, for example. We're introduced to the villainous characters who represent evil, i.e. the three witches. Okay, remember that Hamlet begins, of course, at night time too, and that's supposed to represent the idea of a threat or danger. It's supposed to represent the corrupt Danish state and the fact that the king's ghost, the late king's ghost, has returned then to inform Hamlet that his father had been murdered. Okay, so there's a very particular reason as to why Shakespeare then sets the play at night time and has an external scene. Okay, so Shakespeare simply then lists the characters Rodrigo, Iago, Brabanto, and servants. So at the very beginning, enter Rodrigo and Iago. As I said, Rodrigo is a minor character, a kind of peripheral character, but he does have an important role, essentially, in bringing down the demotion of Michael Cassio later on. And obviously he becomes an integral part of Iago's plan or scheme to unseat and, of course, destroy Othello. So, like I said before, a lot of the minor characters appear at the very beginning. I mean, we even had that in Romeo and Juliet, where the servants of the house of Montague and Capulet appearing at the very beginning. Romeo didn't appear until the end of scene 1. Juliet didn't appear then, of course, until later in the play as well. So we tend to have that, and it tends to build up a sense of tension and intrigue then when it comes to the main character. Where is Othello? How is he involved in this particular plot? Who is he? We don't know yet. We haven't met him. So Rodrigo says at the very beginning, "Tush, never tell me. I take it much unkindly that thou, Iago, hast had my purse as if the strings were thine, shouldst know of this." So we're in the middle of a conversation. It's very intriguing. It's very interesting. Rodrigo mentions money here. He reveals that he has been paying Iago some money. Important plot detail. We wonder why. Okay, he's angry with Iago though, because he's been paying him to do something and Iago hasn't done it. And it's simply referred to as this. So that creates intrigue at the very beginning of the play. What is going on? Why are they arguing? Why is Rodrigo, a gentleman, paying Iago money? Why hasn't Iago done what he said he would do? So Iago says splud, so swearing, of course, by Christ's blood. We'll find that quite a lot, used quite a lot in the play, that particular image. "So you'll not hear me. If ever I to dream of such a matter, abhor me." So, of course, he's denying all of that. He's saying, no, I'm not responsible for that at all. I mean, I didn't tell you because I didn't know myself. And then Rodrigo says, "Thou toldst me that to hold him in thy hate." You told me that you hated him. So you begin to think, okay, who's him? Could that be Othello as such? So that's kind of confirming really the point that I made yesterday, that Iago despises Othello. He resents him because he is successful. He is accomplished. And Iago, of course, is just an ordinary soldier. Iago then says, "Despise me if I do not. The 3 great ones of the city in personal suit to make me his lieutenant. Off cap to him, and by the faith of man, I know my price. I am worth no worse a place, but he, as loving as his own pride and purposes, evades them with a bombast circumstance, horribly stuffed with epithets of war, and in conclusion, none suits my mediators." So he just simply explains, of course, that he got 3 important people to intervene on his behalf to beg, of course, that he would be appointed Othello's lieutenant. And Othello simply refused. So we can see, of course, the roots then of his rage and anger here as such. So then he talks about Michael Cassio. So first of all saying, one Michael Cassio, a Florentine, a fellow almost damned in a fair wife, that never set a squadron in the field, nor the division of a battle knows. So he's kind of emphasising the fact that he resents Michael Cassio for being promoted because he believes that Michael Cassio is kind of a superficial character. He's handsome, but that's about it. He's charming, he's successful with women. We can see, of course, why he would resent that. And also, of course, that he's inexperienced when it comes to battle. And he resents the fact, of course, that Michael Cassio has been promoted over him because Iago is from Venice and Michael Cassio is a Florentine, obviously, from Florence as such. So we're getting a lot of information about Michael Cassio here. So that could be a point that you could mention then, of course, in terms of character or characterization. And we're getting a lot of information just in terms of the plot then as well. What motivates Iago? So we're learning about Iago, we're learning about Michael Cassio, we're learning a little bit about Rodrigo then as well. Okay, so he says, mere prattle without practice is all his soldiership. So he's all talk and no action. He can talk a good game, but he has no experience when it comes to battle. But he, sir, had in the election an eye, whom his eyes have seen the proof at Rhodes, at Cyprus, and other grounds, Christian and heathen, must be belied and calmed. So he's saying, of course, well, I am very experienced in battle. I have seen, of course, warfare at Rhodes and Cyprus, and yet I was overlooked. So he says then Michael Cassio is a countercaster, kind of saying just basically sort of like basically almost like a bookkeeper, an accountant, essentially. Okay, so good as books, but he doesn't have any real experience on the battlefields. He in good time must his lieutenant be, and I, God bless the mark, his worship's ancient. Ancient just simply means the ensign again, the soldier who would carry the flag. So he's angry, he's bitter, he's disappointed. So all of that helps us then to understand the feud between not only Iago and Othello, but between Iago and Michael Cassio, and why he is motivated then to attempt to destroy both men throughout the play. So Rodrigo says then in reply, "By heaven, I rather would have been his hangman." And Iago says, "Why, there's no remedy, 'tis the curse of service. Preferment goes by letter and affection, and not by old gradation." So he's explaining, of course, if you think about the old saying, it's not what you know, it's who you know. Where each second should err to the first. Now, sir, be judge yourself, whether I in any just term are a fin to love the more. So he's saying, look, this explains then how I despise Othello. You now understand why I despise Othello. I couldn't be friendly towards him, essentially, in any real sense. Okay, so Rodrigo then has to accept that because Iago is trying to persuade him, essentially, then that he despises Othello. So Rodrigo says, "I would not follow him then." Okay, so he's kind of going, well, why are you continuing to be his friend and why are you continuing to be part of his army then? And Iago explains, "Oh, sir, content you. I follow him to serve my turn upon him." That's a key line or a key quotation there. So he's saying, of course, that he's biding his time. He's waiting for the right opportunity to strike, and then he will destroy Othello. Okay, so think about it. He's being very manipulative, very persuasive here. He's offering, of course, a logical argument as to why he hates Othello and Michael Cassio, and why he is waiting, or why he is biding his time before he can act against Othello. So think about it. Rodrigo then will just simply accept this as such because it sounds quite plausible. It sounds like something that you would believe. I need more time, really, is what Iago is saying here as such. Okay, so just looking then, he says we cannot all be masters then. We have to bide our time, we have to wait, of course, and we have to seize the ripe opportunity. Okay, so just moving on a little bit then. So he emphasizes then, of course, that he professes to be loyal, okay, to Othello, but that's part of his plan as such. So he reveals then about halfway through that particular speech, "Were I the Moor, I would not be Iago. In following him," and this is the key line here again, "I follow but myself." So he's emphasizing the idea that he's motivated by self-interest. What is the most important thing to him, of course, is being successful. And he has to formulate a plan. And we see, of course, that he has a particular plan in mind, but he is also a cynical opportunist as well. So he's able to manipulate people, and he's also able, of course, then to seize any opportunity that comes his way and use it to his advantage. That's very important because it really demonstrates then not only how cynical he is and how ruthless he is, but how clever, how intelligent he is as well. And the last line then of that particular speech is very revealing. "I am not what I am." So it simply means I am not who I profess to be. I am not who I claim to be. In other words, of course, that he's going to pretend to be a loyal and dutiful friend, of course, to Othello. But the opposite is true. He is working and planning a way then, of course, to destroy him. Now we see the theme of racism come into play, where Rodrigo says, "What a full fortune does the thick lips owe if he can carry thus." So thick lips, of course, obviously would be a racist term directed towards Othello here. So we see how much Rodrigo despises Othello, simply resents him, of course, because he is accomplished, intelligent, a charming man. Obviously, of course, Desdemona has been wooed and seduced by him to a certain degree. So Rodrigo then resents Othello. But think about it, Rodrigo then paints himself as a very negative character because we condemn him for his racism. Now, Iago then prompts Rodrigo to do something, to act. So in terms of the plot, this is very important. What does he encourage him to do? He simply says, "Call up her father." In other words, tell her father. "Rouse him, make after him, poison his delight, proclaim him in the streets, incense her kinsman." So we realise, of course, that this reference at the very beginning of the play was the elopement and marriage of Othello and Desdemona. So Rodrigo, of course, is enraged. He's resentful and bitter. So Iago knows that, and he knows that he can manipulate Rodrigo to suit his plan. So what will Rodrigo do? He will go to Brabantio's house and tell Brabantio, inform him then that Desdemona, his daughter, his young daughter, has eloped with Othello the Moor. Okay, so think of the language that Iago uses here. Poison his delight, proclaim him in the street, incense her kinsman. So he's trying to provoke a violent reaction from Brabantio and from Desdemona's family here. So he says, though he in a fertile climate dwells, so he's happy now, plague him with flies. Though that his joy be joy, yet throw such changes of vexation on it, as it may lose some colour. So anger him. Make sure, of course, that he's incensed and agitated enough to look for Othello and to punish him. So as they're walking along the street, then Rodrigo says, here's her father's house. Here's Brabantio, the senator's house. I'll call aloud. So Iago then encourages him, of course, to shout as loudly as possible. Rodrigo says, what ho, Brabantio, Signor Brabantio. And then Iago then shouts too, awake, what ho, Brabantio, thieves, look to your house, your daughter and your bags, thieves, thieves. So he's associating, of course, kind of thievery, stealing then with Othello. And this kind of relates back to, of course, how women were perceived and presented back then as just chattel, as just property, of course, to be bought and sold. And the idea that Othello has stolen Brabantio's property, his precious daughter. So Brabantio comes to the window then and simply asks, what's the reason of this terrible summons? So why have you woken me then? So Rodrigo then is just simply explaining, and Iago is explaining then, of course, zoons, you are robbed. Zoons just simply reference Christ's wounds. They would usually use that as kind of swear words, zoons or splud, swearing by Christ's blood on the cross or swearing by his wounds, essentially too. Your heart is burst. You have lost half your soul. Even now, very now, notice the racist language again, an old black ram is topping your white ewe. Now, this is very specific because obviously we notice the animal imagery that is used to depict not only Othello, but Desdemona. So what is Iago trying to do here by using an animal image when he's referencing the Moor, first of all? First of all, he's trying to dehumanize him. He's saying, of course, that he's not a man, he's just a monster or a beast, essentially. That he's driven by sexual impulses and lust. So he is degrading the marriage or the relationship between Othello and Desdemona. He's saying it's not a true marriage, it's not based on love or respect, it's just based on sex. Okay, so the animal imagery is very, very strong there. And notice how he emphasizes Othello's age as well. He's trying to rile Brabantio here, trying to anger him. An old black ram, of course, think obviously rams and sheep, topping your white ewe, the female sheep. Rise, awake, the snorting citizens, obviously the snoring with the bell, so hopefully everyone will be up and up in arms, is what he's saying. Brabantio is taken back. What, have you lost your wits? Have you lost your mind? What are you talking about? So Rodrigo then, of course, says, most reverend Signor, do you not recognize my voice? Not I. What are you? In other words, who are you? My name is Rodrigo. Then Brabantio, the worse are welcome. I have charged thee not to haunt about my doors. In honest plainness thou hast heard me say, my daughter is not for thee. So now we understand, of course, that Rodrigo has been annoying and plaguing Brabantio, begging and imploring him to allow Desdemona to marry him, Rodrigo. Okay, so think about it. We know that Rodrigo is desperate at this stage, and that helps us to understand why he is paying Iago to split Othello and Desdemona. So Rodrigo then insists, sir, and Brabantio says, but thou must needs be sure my spirits in my place have in their power to make this bitter to thee. You say, well, patience, good sir. So Brabantio says, well, you're motivated by hatred because you want Desdemona for yourself. Why should I accept what you're saying? He says, why dost thou tellest me of robbing? This is Venice, my house, not a grange. Most grave Brabantio, in simple and pure soul, I have come to you. So he's saying, I'm trying to be honest. I'm being sincere here. I'm looking out for you and your daughter. Okay, so Iago then tries to persuade him, once more using essentially an animal image and emphasizing that Othello is like a lustful horse here as such. So he's reinforcing then the racist attitudes of the time, and he's also playing on Brabantio's kind of latent or inherent racism as well. He knows that if he sort of scratches away at the surface, that Brabantio is racist and does not want Desdemona to marry Othello. So once more he uses vulgar language then when he's describing the coupling or the marriage of Desdemona and Othello. I am one, sir, that comes to tell you your daughter and the Moor are now making the beast with two backs. Once more deliberately using the word beast, and that's where that particular idiom comes from then, the beast with two backs. Once more he's emphasizing the sexual nature of their relationship. There's nothing about tenderness or affection or sincerity or meeting of minds, nothing at all about that. He's focusing purely on the physical aspect of their relationship and depicting Othello then as a lust-crazed beast or animal, just as a creature. He's barely a man. So like I said, dehumanizing Othello then. Okay, so Rodrigo then intervenes and he's trying to convince him then. He's saying, you must believe me then that the Moor and Desdemona are married. So Brabantio is convinced then and says, strike on the tinder, so we need lights, give me a taper, call up all my people. This accident is not unlike my dream. Belief of it oppresses me already. So we get the sense that he's had, maybe we'd say, a few niggles about this before. Maybe he's dreamt about, we'd say, Othello then being with his daughter. So Iago says, farewell, for I must leave. It seems not meet, it's not proper or right, nor wholesome to my place to be productive, as if I say, I shall, against the Moor. For I do know the state, however this may gall him with some check, cannot with safety cast him, for he's embarked with such loud reason to the Cyprus wars, and then another of his fathom they have none to lead their business, in which regard, though I do hate him as I do hell's pains, yet for necessity of present life, I must show out a flag and sign of love, which is indeed but sign. Now, he's emphasising the idea, of course, that he must go to meet with Othello and pretend, of course, to be supportive of him. So it's kind of reinforcing then the idea that Iago is particularly treacherous and particularly devious here. So he's kind of emphasising, of course, oh, well, it's my duty to do this. This is part of the plan. I have to keep him on side. So I have to leave you, Rodrigo, and Brabantio. So he goes to search for him then, of course, at a tavern where Othello and Desdemona actually are, having completed the marriage ceremony or finished the marriage ceremony as such. Okay, so now we see, of course, ironically, Brabantio sympathising with Rodrigo and saying, oh, I wish that she had married you instead, even though he wouldn't give Rodrigo the time of day before this. He had no interest in allowing him to marry Desdemona. So Brabantio then, of course, reacts with anger to the news then that Desdemona has married Othello in secret, and he refers to it as treason of the blood. How she got out. Trust not your daughter's minds. So then he says, of course, how can my trust be abused in this way? Have you not read, Rodrigo, of some such thing? Yes, sir, I have indeed. Call up my brother, so her uncle then. So they want to go and apprehend her and the Moor, to arrest them essentially, because remember, he did not give his permission. Rodrigo then reassures him, I think I can discover him, if you please, to get good guard and go along with me. So they're now firm friends, essentially, Brabantio and Rodrigo. Brabantio then concludes the scene, pray you lead on. At every house I'll call. I'll get weapons. So he wants to assemble, of course, obviously almost like a little army or gang then, to go and seek revenge when it comes to Othello. Raise some special officers of night. On, good Rodrigo, I will deserve your pain. So he says, of course, I will reward you then for your loyalty to me. Okay, now that's a long scene, obviously. When it comes to the summer assessment, you will get just an extract as such. Maybe we'd say page and a half. So it definitely won't be as long as that. So you wouldn't have all of that detail. You might even have, we say, sort of a particular scene, but it would be edited, okay, abridged as such then. So you ask yourself, of course, about the setting. You should have your basic points. The plot then, we know that Rodrigo is paying Iago. We know that Iago is manipulating Rodrigo. We know that Desdemona and Othello have eloped and married. And we see Rodrigo informing Brabantio. Now, there are minor pieces then in terms of characters as well. So what do we learn about Iago? You should have your 3 key characteristics. Think of his role as villain. How does he persuade and manipulate others? How does he use others then for his own advantage? Who is Brabantio, the senator? Can you identify 2 or 3 different traits there? What's his role as then? Does he just simply represent racism in Venice? Does he represent then, we'd say, the opposition to Othello and Desdemona's marriage? Can you identify 1 or 2 particular images or symbols then in Act 1, Scene 1? I think the obvious one being the animal imagery. Okay, we have 2 or 3 clear examples of that. Why is it used? Very simply, to dehumanize Othello, to reinforce the sexual nature of his relationship with Desdemona, to degrade their loving marriage as such. It also gives you an insight then into Iago as well, how cynical he is, that he doesn't seem to believe in the possibility of romantic love. Okay, then think, maybe we'd say simple points on stagecraft. How would you stage this particular scene then? What kind of costumes would the characters wear? What would the backdrop look like? Would you use lighting and music then to enhance the mood, to reinforce, we'd say, particular themes, or to suggest something about characters and their relationships? Right, guys, I'll be focusing on a different scene next week, so hopefully you'll be able to make notes and just practice going over this. Remember that you can look at any scene at all because it's all there on that free app, and it's a good idea just to test yourself then. Can you read the lines? Can you get a general gist of what the lines mean? Remember, you don't have to understand every single word or every single line. Do you have a competent and intelligent understanding of the line or indeed the speech itself? So next week we might look at something like one of Iago's soliloquies, because that gives you a good insight in terms of plot, but also, of course, the machinations, the schemes and plotting then of Iago, the villain himself. Until then, take care.